There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. In J.R.R. Tolkien's books, The Lord of the Rings, at one point he describes how the ring bearer Frodo, after having seen too many difficult times, too much sacrifice, too much death and war and hardship, says to the wise wizard Gandalf, "I wish it had not happened in my time." "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all to live to see such times, but it is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us." And that is the message of Ecclesiastes 3 in a nutshell. The message of Ecclesiastes 3 is straightforward, but it's also confronting. It is God who determines the times that we live in, and we respond to that fact with either frustration that our pride is limited by God's work, or we receive the gift of simple joy that God holds out to us when we honour his rule and seek the wisdom to live well in our times. Now, by times, Ecclesiastes means it's wise to recognise as the circumstances around us that only God can determine. Why? So that we can gain the skills to live well where we find ourselves. Now, for us, we did not choose this time of pandemic and of lockdown and of social isolation. We didn't choose this time of rising unemployment or the sabre rattling that's going on amongst the major world powers at the moment, or the limping market system that's come out of this, or the rising mistrust around the rule of law that used to hold the international community more closely together. And we find in the details of the poem that you've just heard is that it drills down into that and into our daily lives even, where we are asked to discern, is it a time to gather or a time to scatter? Is it a time to love or is it a time to hate? So it's not only our global times but our personal times that are alike from the hand of God. And wisdom, says the teacher, is the humility to recognize this. Wisdom is gaining the skill to deal with what is. Wisdom is not submitting passively to our times as if they're some sort of fate. Wisdom is not seeking to control the times through some sort of magic or technology. Wisdom is recognizing where we are and working with it, taking the opportunities that come with our times and minimizing the dangers that exist in our times. But we have a basic choice to make as we navigate these times that we've been given. Do we respond with frustration, or do we respond with joy? In the verses following the poem, from verse 9 onwards in Ecclesiastes 3, we're told by the teacher that we will experience frustration in the days we've been given. And the teacher says this is because God has given us a sense of past and future, which is a Hebrew way of saying we have a longing for eternity and perfection built into us. But God will not let us regain eternity by our own efforts. It's a wall. In fact, in Genesis 3, it's a cherubim with a flaming sword that keeps us from storming back into Eden. And God does this deliberately, says the teacher in Ecclesiastes, to frustrate our pride. That original pride that we can be like God and define good and evil for ourselves. But also what the teacher has seen, that in that frustration, in that humbling of our pride, there is a pathway to joy through the frustrations of our time. And we'd frankly like to know what that pathway is, because our times are full of frustrations. But here's what he's seen. That joy is found in revering God for all this, in seeing the limits he places on human existence, discerning our times, accepting them as from God's hand, and then seeking wisdom to navigate, to work, to take courage, to act in them as well as we can. I'll be talking more about this kind of decision making when we get to the last talk on the book of Ecclesiastes. But for now, what we need to see is that joy is found in learning contentment and in enjoying actually good and simple gifts, work, food, the company that we do life with. And we receive this joy, says the teacher, as a gift of the same God who frustrates our pride. Now this plugs into a much larger biblical theme. The theme that God lifts up the humble, and in Ecclesiastes he lifts them up with joy. But the proud he casts down. And what the teacher has seen is that he casts them down with frustration. In our world, that tends to look like either despair or distraction. Now, the teacher tells us what the God gift of joy looks like as well. And it's so simple. And we lose this joy so easily. We need to be reminded about it. It's the joy of seeing that everything has its own beauty in its own time. It is fit for its purpose. It's the joy in seeing that everything has its own good. Even if the leaves are short-lived and their colours fade and they fall from the trees to return to the soil, there's wonder and there's joy in all this, in experiencing that joy as a gift that God offers to us. It's the joy of thankfulness and contentment. And we have to admit our culture is not very good at this, is it? It's the joy we get from a walk in the park, or taking a photograph of the full moon, or for the relationships that we have, or for the purr of a cat, or a vegetable garden that's full of produce, or the hug of a loyal friend, or a good meal and great wine and good company, or a job well done with people that you respect. That is the reward the teacher has seen for those who discern their time and avoid either destroying themselves by trying to master the times or by passively giving up before all the challenges that we face in our times. Instead, what they do is they revere the hand of God in the times we have, and then they learn how to cooperate and work with what they're given. But we ask, if God determines the times we're in, what about injustice? What about the wrongs that human beings are doing and have done to each other? How are they judged? Well, the teacher picks this up in the latter part of chapter 3. And what he says quite frankly, it surprises us. But he observes that God uses our injustice, our inhumanity, our wars and our hatred to show us something, to show us that just when we think we're at the height of our powers, just when we think we have the system in place, just when we think we have enough control to take matters into our own hands, just when we think we have mastered the times, a mirror is held up. And what we see there teaches us that we're not gods, that our injustice and our pride in doing these things, we're like reactive animals. In fact, we've become far less than what we were made to be because we try to grasp to become more than what we are. And that's why the master race will always be shown to be the monster race, because God will hold up the mirror. That's why all final solutions are evidence of the first problem, our insane pride. God holds up the mirror to us. That's why every re-education camp is evidence of how ignorant we are, and why no war to end all wars ever will. Ecclesiastes observes that we are the image of God. We are the speaking animal. But when we try to replace God with ourselves, we end up doing things that no animal would ever be guilty of. And we're humiliated, quite frankly, by the wrongs that we've done. I remember this vividly at high school when we were made to read in social studies photojournals of the European concentration camps that the Allies discovered towards the end of the Third Reich as it was falling. I remember then at university reading study after study after study, which was trying to explain how it could be that decent, intelligent, hardworking people had participated in crimes like that. Were we really capable of doing those things? So what the teacher of Ecclesiastes sees, and it's a profound point about human wrong, is that God is not mocked by our injustice. When we most seek to rebel against his rule, when we most seek to push against the moral pulse that God builds into his world, as we learnt about recently in the book of Proverbs, we do not mock God. We end up mocking ourselves. I've talked about time, the times that we're in. I want to finish by talking about joy. Joy is a beat in the book of Ecclesiastes. After each challenging section that he gives us, the teacher finishes with a call to pursue joy. The gifts of joy that God offers us in daily life. So here in chapter 3, it's the same. After talking about the rhythm that God determines our times with, the power of God in our times that frustrates our pride and that can even mock our justice, he asks, what are we to do in the face of all this? Well, he says in the very, very last verse there, we're to pursue joy. Jesus, in the end of his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, picks up this theme of the work of God versus the work of human beings, and the idea that we need to revere God if we are to live wisely. So let me read you his parable. Therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But anyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now, Jesus' point, like Ecclesiastes, is that our lives will face times. We will face challenge and frustration and danger and change and winds and floods and rains that we cannot master. But the difference in Jesus' parable is the foundation, what we build our lives out of. If we build our lives out of ourselves, out of our own quest for meaning, our own search for significance, our own need to make a dent in the universe, as Steve Jobs famously said, we're going to know some frustration. And that's going to take a lot of different forms in our culture. But if the foundation is the fear of God, hearing the words of God and observing the works of God in his world, and if we're wise enough to discern the times and to seek grace enough to navigate them well, then Ecclesiastes says that there's a joy that God holds out to us in the simplest of things. And we don't have to be rich or clever or an overachiever to experience this joy. In fact, in my experience, people with those things are often too busy. We just need to be a person who knows God and who God knows.